Hello, my HS 103 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 13. We are past Turkey Week and Thanksgiving Week, depending on whether or not you celebrate the holiday, just as a time for family gatherings and so on, or you celebrate the holiday, with no real understanding of why the indigenous might not like Thanksgiving and what it symbolizes in terms of their racial marginalization, not just in the United States, but across the entire Western Hemisphere, right? Depending on how you did that, you're back and you made it through. So welcome back. But now we're in the home stretch of the semester. We're in the last 2 weeks of this course. We're in the last 2 full weeks of the semester. You'll have probably a 2 or 3 day reading period to end the semester. The week of December the 11th and 12th and 13th, and then things are over, and that's that. So, really, what I'm talking to you about today is really prepping for getting your projects done, getting your freestyle projects, assignments done, and for the end of the course, whatever I'm doing these last 2 days. We will meet virtually on Tuesday, November the 29th. We meet in person the remainder of the semester, depending on how many people are doing in-class presentations. For each section of my class, the maximum number of people can represent over a 2 class period is 8. You account for 10 minutes of presentation time in person, plus any questions students might have or I might have. And for those who have larger groups, you're probably going to be pushing it closer to 15 minutes of presentation time. So, if you do that times 4, that pretty much uses up an hour and 15 minutes right there. And you do 4 more, another hour and 15, maybe 5 minutes for me to talk max, and that's it. That's it, right? We're done after December the 8th. So, this is the course. So I'll talk to you about a little bit more about that. I'll talk to you about what I'm planning on covering this week, and that will be it for this week. I guess I'm not going to be doing much of these next week, right? And maybe just talking to you about stuff, right, regarding wrapping up the course in general. Let me start first with this. Your freelance. This is what happens when you write freelance. Your freestyle assignments, your projects are due to me by Sunday, December the 4th, by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I have daylight time, but there is no daylight time because we have standard time now. So there's that. And just like with everything else, if you're overdue and you don't have an extension, you lose 11 points, right? Even if it's a minute, you lose 11 points. If you do not get it to me within 168 hours of the due time, which is by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, December the 11th, you lose all your points. And if you lose all your points, you will likely fail the course or get a D. So please, please, please be an adult and get your stuff in, not only either in a timely manner or be an adult and be adult enough to let me know you're going to need more time for whatever reason, right? You know, but keep in mind, this is the caveat with this one though, because there is a component of this that involves peer review, because since most people, 97% of the class is going to be doing going to 80-90% of folks are going to be doing video. They're going to record themselves in video, singing, dancing, writing poetry, doing a podcast, doing man on the street interviews, doing a collage, whatever it is they're doing, right? Whatever your project happens to be on, right? And cutting in video with a PowerPoint presentation, doing a music list and playing that music and listing lyrics, writing a short paper to basically go with whatever they're presenting, or paper by itself where you just spend 5 minutes summarizing what you've talked about or whatnot in your paper, that kind of thing. However you're doing it, it's probably going to involve audio visual material. And if you've used Moodle and you know Moodle's been for me this semester, and this is my first semester using it. Hopefully, my last one in terms of not in terms of how much I used it, because it's not a good software package. The most you can load up is 100 megabytes worth of information, 100 MB. That is not enough for most video. Um, you know, if you do a 5 minute video through Zoom, yeah, you could probably load it up. And if that's the case and you're doing this short summary or whatever, that's fine. But generally speaking, that means using a third party. That means using, I don't know, Instagram, SoundCloud, um, you know, Minio, right? Certainly YouTube, any number of these things. And it's important that as part of what you load up, you just provide the link. I have left textual space within everybody's boxes so that you can go ahead and just put down, here's the link to my project, here's the link to my video, here's the link to my PowerPoint presentation, here's the link to whatever, right? So that I have it. And those links need to be open for people to give feedback on. Because if you could do this in class, you would, you'd want to hear what your peers think about what you did, right? Did you do a good job? Did they like it? Were there any problems? Any critique? Not quite the same as what we did for the writing assignment, because you're not going to review the critique and then redo your project. You're just getting feedback and comments in general. And so you want to set up the links so that they're shareable, so that other people can comment and not close comments on those things, right? And so that's a big deal. There are other things I want to talk about regarding, procedurally, and they'll be in the announcements, and I'll reiterate them in class this week and probably in the beginning of next week as well, just so people understand. But the main thing to understand in terms of this, besides keeping your links open, whether you're, even if you're just submitting a paper as a link through, or PowerPoint as a link in Google Docs or Google Spreadsheets or whatever it's called, right? I don't remember. Google Slides is what it's called actually, right? You want those links to be shareable so that people can provide comments and feedback. You even want to create space in those documents so that people can provide comments and feedback. That would be preferable. Even if you're doing a Word document, you need to do that. For those of you who love PDF and who've gotten on my nerves all semester long about submitting in PDF, technically, yes, you can submit in PDF, particularly if you're doing slides, but leave some space so that I can comment. Even if no one else comments but me, I might need some space to say a couple of things about your thing, right? And not have to create it. Because part of this, your participation grade for the last couple of weeks of the course is in fact really focused on this, on your feedback to each other on your projects. It's already in the syllabus in terms of what I expect. I'll reiterate this in announcements, and I'll reiterate this when it comes time to publish all the links and get everyone's attention in terms of who's done what project on what thing, so that people have time to get to it. But the main thing even beyond that is this. Say you need an extension. Say you need an extension for 2 or 3 days, right? You will not, if I do not have your stuff by the end of the day on Wednesday, December the 7th, regardless of whether you legitimately needed more time or not, your peers will not be reviewing your stuff. I am not going to be spending my whole last week of the semester while I'm trying to prep for grading for all of your assignments, all of your freestyle assignments, while getting ready also for next semester, while getting ready to submit final grades and everything else. Going, oh, you decided to do your third revision, you decided to do an extra extension, you decided to do, no. The most time you will get in terms of having peer review is 3 days. You'll have from the end of the, between Sunday and regardless of whether you have an extension or not, if I do not have your stuff by Wednesday, end of the day, Wednesday, December the 7th, so that's not going to your peers. You're not losing points, but it's not going to your peers, and that would be very disappointing to do all that work so that the only person who's watching it is me, right? So get your stuff in. We're pushing up against the end of the semester anyway, and so if I don't have your stuff by the 11th, that's I don't have time to be waiting around for you to get your stuff in. You've had 4 weeks to work on this. If you've been more studious and productive, maybe even 5 weeks if you consider Turkey week. And certainly the week of thinking about your project is an additional week. So you've been thinking about this pretty much for the second half of the semester. So there's that. Um, Trying to think, is there anything else I really need to cover in terms of that? Well, anyway, in any case, I'll have more stuff about this stuff regarding your freelance assignments and announcements in textual form so that you have that, and just listen to me yammer on about what to expect. By the way, a lot of this stuff is also in the syllabus. So there's that too. This week is pretty simple as far as U.S. history is concerned. I have essentially covered everything through the 1990s and early zeros in terms of U.S. interventions since 9/11, U.S. policy, international foreign and military policies and strategies since the end of the Cold War, a bit about the 1980s, 1990s, and zeros in terms of economic development and economic turmoil within the U.S. What I have not covered really is how that is translated into big time politics in the US and the politics of racism, the politics of xenophobia, the politics of misogyny, the politics of homophobia and transphobia, class warfare in the US since the Reagan era. I've covered it in bits and pieces. I've shown examples of it in some video and other things, but I've not covered it in a direct sense pretty much since the Reagan era. And so that's this week. Tomorrow, on Tuesday, when we meet virtually on Microsoft Teams, what we will do is basically take us up through the Obama era. I will take you through, from basically Bush to Clinton, Clinton to Bush 2 or Bush 43 or W to Obama, and looking at that and looking at things like Hurricane Katrina, looking at things like how the country domestically responded to 9/11, and its constant anti-Arab Muslim, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamophobia, really, and how the country's, the economic stagnation that the country experienced in the 2000s after the internet bubble burst, and then later the housing bubble, which was really big, blew up, and blew up in the negative way, not the more African American vernacular sort of way, right? It's destroyed millions of people's savings and lives, right? Kind of thing. And how that's had an impact in terms of our politics, expecting presidents to turn economies around, right? Expecting presidents to do magical kinds of stuff, right? And then, ultimately getting to Obama and the Obama era, is supposedly this period of time where the country's become post-racial for 3 years between 2008 and 2011. Experts like me, and I'll use small e expert because I'm not that well known, right? Small e experts like me and bigger e experts who are saying, you know, I wasn't saying post-racial. I was saying no, there's no such thing as post-racial. Not in a country that's built on racism, right? Or is racism encoded within its DNA, right? It's not just some aberration. It's there. It's right in the code, right? If you believe in the Matrix and you've seen the Matrix code includes racism, right? It just does, right? And so, but hearing other experts, big E experts, people on TV regularly, people who've written whole books about this, talking about how the country is post-black or it's post-racial, right? And we are no more post-racial than we are post-pandemic, to be honest with you. And I will say that again. That has basically been my motto since 2010, since 2020, 2021. You know, that we are not post-racial. We are no more post-racial than we're post-COVID or post-pandemic. COVID's very much out there, still killing people. Upwards of 1,000 people at least recorded in a day. In this country, forget about around the world. Um, Not to mention the tens to hundreds of thousands of people made sick by this every day. The 1 out of 7 people in this country who are of long-term issues because of COVID, in terms of their immune response, in terms of loss of hair and loss of energy, brain fog, and millions of other things. So if we're not past that, how are we going to be past something that's been encoded in our country from its very foundations, right? Right? Definitely past that. But yes, there was this expectation that somehow that if 41% of white voters or the 41% of the white voters who voted for Obama in 2008, that somehow he would magically the country from the economic downturn that was putting millions of people out of work per month in 2008, in the beginning of 2009. And while he did do some work and it did help ameliorate the worst effects of the Great Recession, the truth of the matter is lots of people spent their 2010s trying to crawl out of the hole that was left by the cratering of the economy at the end of the double odds. Yours truly included, right? Not that my hole was as big as some other people's, but it wasn't small, right? Yours truly included. Millions of people faced this in a way, that it was actually worse than the recession of 1980, the early 1980s recession. That was actually worse than the recession of the early 90s, or even the stagnation of the early zeros, because it involved housing, and housing is the primary purveyor of generational wealth for middle class Americans, which made up at this point roughly half the country. And so once that cratered, once that fell apart, it put millions of people in holes that they would never really thought existed for them, because their houses were underwater, and that meant that a lot of people fell out of the middle class. They either fell into what we would call the struggling middle class, of people who were basically robbing people to pay, Peter to pay Paul in order to maintain a middle class lifestyle. Right? That was most of the 2010s for folks, right? Or they fell completely out of the middle class entirely into the working poor, which describes literally 40% of the country. That's 40% of the country in some way, shape, or form by the end of the Obama era in 2016. So, you can talk about gig economy and all that other stuff. In some respects, y'all all know this too well. Even for those of you whose parents weathered the Great Recession fine, whose parents who are affluent, and therefore it had there was no impact really financially on them in any direct shape or form, because you saw it all around you. More people, more house people on the street, more issues in terms of opiate abuse, more issues in terms of downtowns being quiet, in terms of the business sector being quiet, but other places where people are just out on the street at weird times of day who normally would be working because they don't have a job, right? That kind of thing. You've seen it. You've seen it growing up, and it's probably part of the general sense of NUI and disengagement that I've seen out of students a lot since really about 2015, 2016. I've seen it more and more as a result of the pandemic, but I've seen it in people's eyes pretty much since about 2015. So Obama didn't save the country, but Obama did become a lightning rod for the racism that still exists in the United States, very much as real, very much as there. From the rise of the Tea Party in 2009 and 2010, and with the expectation of Mitch McConnell and others to basically make their goal as congressmen and as senators, Republicans, to make sure that Obama was a one-term president. He came in with such a high approval rating, 72%, and wasn't able to do a lot with that, even with Democrats controlling both houses, even with the Democrats on the verge of a near supermajority of 60 in the Senate. Not able to do a whole lot because Obama, just like Clinton, even to some extent, just like Carter before them, practiced a sort of neoliberal sort of politics of austerity on the side of social welfare programs. Now, he didn't starve the programs the way W did in for that matter, even Clinton did in the 90s and zeros, but they certainly weren't keeping up with inflation, right? He failed at getting the minimum wage up from $7.25 an hour. After 2009, and and mind you, we've had the same federal minimum wage standard since '09, even though there's this whole outcry in 11 and 12 around in Occupy Wall Street, and the fact that no one can survive off $7.25 an hour, yet we're expecting people to pay for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000 of rent in cities like New York and San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and other places. And so the politics are such that you can have all the economic anxiety in the world. How does that translate into racism unless you have a racist society to begin with, right? And so Obama becomes scapegoated eventually for the lack of economic mobility, social mobility of folks in the U.S. during his time in office, which is typically the case of any president who can't deliver on their promises. The only promise he really delivers on, and it's not even quite fully delivered on, is Obamacare or the ACA, right? Which goes through court battles. And, the other side tries to repeal something like 40 times while Obama's in office. Mostly symbolic. Even when Republicans gained control of the House in 2014. It's in 2010, and then the Senate in 2014. It's mostly symbolic work, right? So anyway, bottom line is this: is that I mean, you don't need me to tell you this because this is your lifetime, right? It's not just my lifetime anymore. You're alive for a lot of this stuff. You might not be aware of all of it. Maybe you're not even aware of most of it, but you are alive at a time where there's austerity on the social welfare side. There is more and more expenditures in terms of the military industrial complex on the federal government side of spending. I mean, to the point where, Bush tried to hide that money and basically not count it as part of the budget, where Obama made it part of the budget after the 2009-2010 budget, made it part of the budget. You could see the $7 trillion of extra expenditures being spent in Iraq and Afghanistan and other excursions around the world. All of that, that led to really the tug of war that we've seen between one party that has become center right, which is the Democratic Party, right? And it's in their policy. But another party has moved even further to the right than that. A party that is more increasingly made up of, for lack of a better way of putting it, fascist, because that's what far right means. It means that you use the politics of racism and racial resentment, of economic anxiety, and you find scapegoats. You find people and say, these are people that are these people are the reason why you don't have what you have. These are the people these are the people who are the reason why you don't have social mobility. So blame black people, blame poor black people, blame poor white people who are opioid addicts and wish them dead. Blame homosexuals. Blame people of color in general. Blame Asian folks. Particularly Chinese, because their country is on the verge of being the number one economy in the world, and we don't want that kind of competition, right? Donald Trump rises out of all of this, and he rises out of all of this, and that's the other part of what I want to talk about. He rises out of all this by first blaming Obama, by saying that Obama basically is a foreign national who was not born in the United States and therefore shouldn't have been president in the first place. That there was an entire conspiracy to basically make him the president of the United States. This is how Trump moves out of the arena of the clown car of "you're fired," on his show, on NBC. Because, when you have that many viewers, that means that many people are listening to you and hanging on your every ear, to the role of big time politics. Sarah Kinzier has basically written 2 whole books about the rise of Trump and the rise of fascism in the United States. And she has written in point of fact about that transition for Trump, that Trump has always wanted to be president, but he was able to use Obama as his launch pad. And as a country that has already been through things like Civil War, Black Codes, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow, there's always a backlash whenever it's perceived that black folks are doing better, or as well as white people in this country. That has always been the case. And why wouldn't there be a backlash? Because their first president of color, first black president, is president of the United States. Of course, there's going to be a backlash, especially with lack of economic growth, with gig economy dreams and working poor realities, right? With an opioid epidemic that is increasingly beyond the control of the local to control, with austerity on the one hand regarding social welfare programs, a war on drugs still continuing, and increasing violence among police toward those who protest against such things, right? Whether it's Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, whatever you want to point out, right? And so it's not hard to see that someone who otherwise many people would have normally perceived and definitely perceived back in the 1980s and 90s as a clown, right? As a clown playing around with daddy war bucks as money in the case of Donald Trump, who eventually becomes president of the United States. We already had an actor as president in Reagan, right? We had someone that people thought barely could articulate themselves in W as president for 2 terms. How hard is it going to be to get someone who otherwise who's a racist, who's anti-black, and is anti-queer, who's a misogynist beyond belief, right? A grifter really, become president of the United States. It's not that hard. It's not that hard to transition. And for those of you in class who actually do support Trump, who actually are, make America great again types, and there might be a few of you, because I've, surprisingly sometimes bumped into a few of them in the courses I've taught over the last 6 years. This is hard to hear. I know it's hard to hear, but nothing I've said is unsubstantiated. You don't have to do more than go through the archives of New York Daily News to look at Donald Trump, how Donald Trump was covered in the period of time between, say, 1979 through 2016 to understand how he has shifted himself and used the politics of resentment, of racism, of other isms in order to promote himself throughout his life and times. It doesn't matter if Al Sharpton is his friend or he knew Mike Tyson. So what? There are plenty of bigots who are friends with other people, who generally despise the group, but might have the individuals who they think are exceptions, right? And so it's not hard to see people who think that they were proving that racism was wrong in '08 by voting for Obama, and that they themselves weren't racist because they voted for Obama, who then would switch and vote for Trump and vote in favor of Trump in 2016 and everything that Trump was selling. So that's basically what I want to cover this week. And so I just want to make sure that all of that is clear, that that's the direction I'm going in. So we'll see if there's anything more to add for next week. I don't think so, but I think that gets us pretty much to about 2022.